which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, first thing on the agenda says update on solar projects.
Well, two major updates. We don't have any new projects in front of us. We had that big rush at the last board meeting, all those resolutions. So remember, next thing at Black River, there was big. They had contacted us a week before the board meeting saying, we need to get this thing done. They're restructuring their finance. And my initial reply was, I'm not sure we can get on the agenda, in time. And what I was thinking at that point in time was the work it would require on Justin's part. But Justin said, hey, we can bend over backwards to do that, which he did. So he's glutton for punishment, I guess, Justin. But so we did all that. And then they're supposed to close the 22nd. And we got an email Tuesday saying, we're not going to be ready to close the 22nd. In fact, we won't be able to close anytime in December. So, so like Justin said, thanks for the fire drill. So I just sent a note saying, well, I would, I get delays happen. Given the urgency, a delay of a couple of days wouldn't surprise me. But the fact now you're saying it's indefinite, right. I just say I think it's fair in the circumstances and the rush that we did that we should at least invoice you for the legal fees to date, so they get things in. So that's what we're going to do with invoicing for that. So. Justin, thanks for that effort for that board. I mean, that December board meeting, we had a lot of crap that you had to get ready for us to do, and just throwing one more in there that ended up not following through.
Have you had the opportunity to talk to Valerie yet from Shimo?
I did talk to Val. I told her that we were, and for those who know, Valerie is the mayor up in Shimo, where they have the Convergent Norbit solar project. I told her, hey, she was happy. I said, look, we're looking into it. We're reaching out to the company to see if they'd be interested in if they would provide a permanent easement as part of a pilot. I think, we talked about your preferences. I think we talked about trying to offer a 10-year pilot, not a 15-year pilot. I'm not sure if that's going to satisfy them at all or not, but we'll see. But she was happy. I said, I'll let you know. I did try calling Kemi Morrison. She was in a superintendent's meeting, so I just sent her an email kind of summarizing, here's where we're at. Look, you were against it before. We didn't pursue it because we didn't need the school's approval, but given that the school was strongly against it and the town and village were sort of lukewarm to it, but now we're in a case where the municipal government is coming to us saying, we need you to do something. So we're going to be going ahead. Now that she called me, we can talk about it further, but otherwise, if I don't hear from her, I'll be getting back to her once we know where we're at with Convergent and what we're thinking about for numbers.
So does it appear they're moving off from center, from the school board side of it?
So apparently, well,
I'm
not sure the schools move. I mean, they really won't have a choice. I mean, we don't need their approval to do the pilot under the UTEP. But now that we have the village desperate for us to do something to keep that trail open for the snowmobile, because I mean, she actually spoke to Marshall directly a couple of weeks ago before Bill spoke to her. Just frantic with last year, whether it was part of construction or why, but with the lack of access, the businesses felt the impact. And for those businesses, those snowmobiles that were still trying to access town, were doing so crossing people's lawns, causing traffic issues, and she was getting complaints, and she was just at wit's end when Marshall reported on his conversation with her. So that's kind of where we're at this point in time. So
the only plus we may have is the new supervisor in the town of Lyme, right now is on the school board.
Okay.
I think I don't know if he can still be on both, but so there is a connection there. And he actually come to one of our meetings one time, Terry Countryman, and I think he does have an interest in pursuing that, but I think he was maybe in the minority on the school board.
Yeah. Well, I made a point in my note to Kami. I don't think it's going to impact the tax cap the way you think it's going to. And besides, the problem right now is we've got the local government. I mean, it's impacting the businesses, which in turn is going to impact their tax base, which is going to impact your tax base. So that's where we're at that one. So those are kind of the two main solar updates. Where we're at in Lyme, Shimo, and where we're at. Oh, and when I did talk to Valerie, she said that Norbit did give them an easement for the trail this year, but basically with an agreement that it could be closed at any time. So I don't know if he's opening it up with a goodwill, while he's hoping that we put something in place to.
Well, that would be good.
Keep it up permanent. So it's open at least for the time being, but we want to make sure it's permanent. is not gonna be closed anytime in the future, so.
So it looks like that whole thing is,
Bill, the only problem I see, Dave, you said that, we don't need the school's permission, but we have two other projects, big projects that are proposed there. If we ignore the school now, it's only gonna make the process a lot harder if either of those two projects go forward, because there'll be deviations and we will need their approval.
Well, that's,
I think we need to take the position that if it was me, I'd be telling the village mayor and the town supervisor that they gotta get the school on board if they want something
Yeah.
like that.
well, the difference too is that, I mean, those projects, yeah, we'll need, for deviations, if that's what we end up doing, we'll need their support, but those projects are not likely to impact the villages directly as this trail access to the services at this point in time, so.
Yeah, I understand the whole issue with the snowmobile trail. I think I told you that.
Yeah.
And we should condition permanent easement on any agreement with that company. And Bill, you can correct me, hasn't it been Norbit that's been pushing this issue, not the company?
Yeah,
Yes, so we'll need the pilot application to come from the company. I mean, not Norba. I mean, he's a landowner, but apparently he sold the project, so. But there must be some tie-in with his agreement with them
I'm sure.
that otherwise he wouldn't be the one pushing it so much at this point, so.
And it does appear, I know you've probably been tracking this better than me, Paul, but it does appear that one project in Brownville may be one of the first ones out of the box as far as a major, in the setting process. Have you been looking at those to see?
Yeah, it looks like Boralex and the Brownville Chameau project are the furthest along in this county. The Tracy project in Orleans just got a determination that it's an incomplete application, so they gotta respond to issues raised by the siting board. So,
Well, the other issue I'll bring up too, just since it was mentioned at a previous meeting, Paul had noted that the AES project up in the town of Watertown, which was a 487 project, so it didn't involve us, but they were $20,000 delinquent for the last several years on their special district taxes. So I reached out to Eric Will, who's our contact for the larger project we're proposing. Shared him things, I got a copy of the tax bill, sent that to him, shared information from Paul. He was tracking it down. He called me back. He said, I kind of proud of myself. We're a big company. I've been able to actually find the person who can pay the bill. She just said, get me the information, I'll get it paid. So hopefully that'll resolve itself pretty soon. But
Good.
because I explained, because he said, yeah, we don't want to be seen as someone that's, I'm not sure how it fell through the cracks, but he goes, I'll make sure it gets paid.
Especially with their proposal for the big project.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we're done with that. The proposed fee schedule.
So what we're talking about, it's kind of a starting point where you want to go up or down or leave it as it is. We talked about adjusting our fee from 2% down to 1.5%. And then, you see in the bottom, and also adding in there an annual fee first we talked about doing an annual fee just for the solar projects, but then I think someone said, well, why don't we just be consistent, also do it with all of them? And the same thing for the, reassignment, if they're going to apply for reassignment. So you got the fees there in front of you.
Is that fee adjustment in line with like other counties then, Dave?
Pardon?
Is that in line with like other counties?
We're still higher. Most of the other counties are around 1%, some are 1.25%. So we're still a higher fee of 1.5% even.
I feel comfortable with that. I was a critic of us not trying to necessarily be in a position where we feel we're competing with other counties. So to go from the 2% to the 1.5%, and then with the annual maintenance fees, it's like, I think that's a good compromise. And I will reiterate, I don't think we need to be competitive with the rest of the counties on fee schedules.
Yeah.
And the other counties don't have the annual fees.
Many of them do.
Many of
have
them
the
do.
fee, yeah. It varies. Some of them, instead of a flat flat annual fee, it may depend on the size of the project. Project sizes may pay $1,000. Large projects maybe $1,500, or some may be as low as $500. They may have a two-tiered, but most most of them, from what we saw, what Marshall was looking at, I think we're right in that ballpark. And we're proposing a higher administrative, 1,500 as opposed to 1,000 for the renewable energy, just because there's a little bit more work on Lyle's part to administer those billings and payments.
Yep, it sounds good to me. Any comments, Paul?
Well, I'm looking at our application where the
Oh.
fee schedule has a list of renewable energy project costs and information together. And in there, Dave, you've added community adder. I think it's page 4 of.
Oh, yeah, well, let's talk about that separate. This is just,
Okay.
right now, we're just talking about the fee schedule, so.
I'm okay with where we are with that.
Okay.
And like, the point Justin made to us too, I mean, with our fee being so high at 2%, it kind of creates an incentive for projects, particularly solar projects, to kind of lowball their estimates for the project cost because of the additional cost.
Sure.
So if we're comfortable with that, you can propose that and we'll bring it to the board at the January meeting.
Yep.
While we're putting reassignment for all projects, that typically doesn't happen with our it's really pretty much with these renewable energy projects that tends to happen, so.
Do you foresee like in workload coming back, visualizing 25 or 30 projects completed here down the road in a couple of years? Do you think that annual fee, I mean, there's a fair amount of monitoring every year. I mean, is that going to create almost like a half of a person or?
No, I think the annual fee is just something that'll get tacked out when we do our annual pilot billing. We'll just bill it as part of that pilot invoice, for the pilot payment.
But as far as with, say, 30 projects, workload to monitor those every year, it's not going to put any additional staff requirements.
Oh, you mean like on the renewable energy projects? I don't think so, no.
So what are the requirements on the lease for these things? Because like in a company, you have to have show employment and that sort of thing. What is it we're asking for on a pilot program for a solar?
Oh, okay, we can talk about that next.
Okay.
Yep, the application information, which is the last page, right? A big score.
So I'm trying what else. So I put the community adder call because that was something you mentioned we ought to be adding. There was something else you had mentioned we ought to be adding to that for information as well.
Yeah. There are two factors that are used in the valuation model. One is the community adder, the other one is the community or market transition credit. We should just add another line because they get one or the other, but not both. So if we could add that in, then we will gather enough information for the local community to do the valuation and for us to use the model to try to determine how far to go with taxation relief.
Is it the community market or transition credit? Those are two separate credits or just?
There's a community adder and the other one on the model I have says community or market transition credit.
Oh.
And I know that is when I talked to TJ, he gave me an estimate of what he thought that was for their project. It wasn't a community adder, it was the market transition credit.
You get one or the other, you don't get both.
So it's just adding another line asking for that information.
Okay. All right, okay. Anybody else think of anything else we ought to be adding on there?
I just have a question while we're talking about that, the battery system costs, the battery storage costs there. My question for Justin, has anyone that you've been aware of been talking about, the state has punted on the issue of impact of battery storage on these projects? Well, from the webinar we were on, they basically said this doesn't deal with battery storage. You have any information on how other areas may be handling storage valuation or how they're handling storage at all?
I've seen a couple projects that treat the storage just like the production side in terms of the megawatt capacity, just as an adder. I know you have a few pilots that at some point added battery storage metrics if it were ever brought to bear or added onto a project. I'm not sure what the economics, what drove those. It didn't look like it was correlating to the megawatts that the project was rated at, so I'm not sure what you guys did there. I've seen, just adding on a corresponding formula for the amount of storage to the pilot payment. Again, a lot of these things look like shipping containers. They can be lifted, taken away pretty easily. So there's probably some debate as to whether they're ratables, or removable equipment, but to the extent that they are added on, I've seen them treated much like the production side on panel capacity.
But it is an additional income stream.
It stabilizes their output on fluctuations in sunlight, just like same thing with wind. It allows them to keep pouring energy into the grid off cycle.
Yeah, I think Oya, we had a few projects Oya did, and we had a battery storage. It was,
And they ended up adding it, so we added it
there
to the
was
last.
$200 a megawatt, I think, it amounted to it. No,
Was that a figure that came out of that appraisal that we had done? Is that where that figure came from?
I don't think so. I think that was something that we just kind of agreed with Oya on.
Like, I think Oya only put in 4 megawatts of battery storage when their entire facility is like 20. So
Right.
I think Justin's right, that it's just a small chunk of the overall project output, so.
Yep.
We'll leave that up to the town assessors to figure, but the question for us is, do we work that into a pilot agreement? Something, an adder for the battery storage. So,
Well, you already have. You have a history of it. I'm not familiar with what was negotiated on those, whether you want to make that your uniform approach.
well, I'm thinking more, what does it really add to the value, so we can be fair about it. If we're going to shoot for 50% of full taxation, then we should, kind of get an idea what 50% of the value of a battery storage is all I'm thinking, so.
If I remember right, with the Oya, those were some of the first projects. I think we were kind of using that NYSERDA suggestion of percentage and equated that to the batteries.
Yeah, I can tell you where they got their data.
Yeah.
Well, but in theory, as
Well, in the webinar, the guys from the state said, well, we don't know of any battery storage systems installed yet. And it was all I could do is say, well, we've got them already installed in our town.
Correct.
Because Oya's already installed them. So,
but
the state is behind on trying to provide guidance on those. It'll come in time.
still, as far as taxation, correct me if I'm wrong, but for a site to build battery capacity equal to the output, say a lot of these 20 megawatt sites, the value of building that infrastructure at their rated capacity would equal almost the value of the project itself. Is that not right?
Well, 20 megawatt battery storage would be a huge,
Right.
huge.
Well, it's a multi-million dollar, investment.
I don't know what kind of a footprint that would even be.
Well, bear in mind Oya, and that's the one in Clayton. I think they're designed for 20 megawatts and they have 4.5 storage. So, that's a quarter of their output roughly.
It doesn't increase their total output. All it does is, like Justin was saying, that you can store it and then sell it at a better time. So
You sell it when the sun's down.
right. Your solar panels are still only gonna make X amount of
Right.
megawatts. They're gonna
True.
store part of it and then sell it at a better time of the day when
Yeah.
they get more money for it. That's how they're gonna.
Yeah. Yeah, under that taxation structure, but under normal circumstances of capital assets, it's gonna double the cost of the project.
That thing hasn't let up in a day and a half.
Well, when you take
It's,
positions,
hello,
high importance in Jefferson County.
it's only gonna get worse, Bill.
Sorry, Bill.
Can I bring up another issue that is concerning to me, and since I hear Jay in the background, which is normal.
What are you trying to say, Paul?
Well, I want to talk about the project in Adams and Ellisburg. I know you're aware of it, it's a Borlex project, it's it is not Green Creek, it's Sandy Creek Solar.
Yeah,
And it's in two towns, and Doug Schoen, Diane, and his son Devin are on this decommissioning panel that Jay's going to talk about in a second. But I was talking with Doug, and I asked him, I haven't heard back from Doug, but I'm concerned about whether or not some of these taxing jurisdictions really understood the 60-day response time from when a project tells you they're going to move forward. And my question for Justin is, can a project send that notice before they have zoning approval?
Yeah, it's not, they don't need to be approved, so, they just need to send the notice. If there isn't an opt-out in place, they can send the notice at any point saying they intend to build, and either have an active site plan application or an active zoning application or special use permit application after the fact or during. There's a lot of rural places that don't have any site plan or any zoning, so some of them just got to pull a building permit.
Okay.
So it's kind of depends on the circumstance. So there may be no awareness locally in some cases that the project's even in the planning mode, other than maybe an obscure DEC permit for stormwater or otherwise, or a court permit that a town might not even be involved in.
Well, I told Doug to check his records to see if they responded to the developer. One, did they get a notice that suffices as required by law from the developer? And two, did you respond? The last thing we need to do is be so caught in the project, then have them find out they're gonna pull the trigger and want a full exemption because they didn't respond. So,
Yeah, didn't I just read something where that process is changing? That 60-day, maybe I'm wrong, but,
Well,
where maybe a taxing jurisdiction makes a statement that all of those are gonna be required, and that serves the
I got a
purpose.
call from David Olson, Bill, when I was making the inquiries about the AES project, because it's now in tax enforcement. They literally are defaulted delinquent enough that the county has it in their in-room proceedings this year. So, but he called me and I explained to him my concerns about that and suggested he look into the law, because I believe now the county municipalities can pass a local law on the school districts just stating that they're going to require all applicants to negotiate a pilot tax. So you do it once, and then you're never going to be in a case where a notice is missed. Unless something's changed in the law, that was one of the options that was put into the governor's proposal last year.
Okay, yeah, that was
I
it.
suggested he research it, and if that's the case, maybe the county wants to adopt that local law so they don't have to worry about missing one of those notices from the developer.
I put that on my list.
So,
Justin, am I correct in my assumption that there's now that option?
I know there was proposals in place. I'm not sure if there was a specific amendment for it. Process, I can check that. See what
Well-
we got up there.
So,
I'm really concerned that, with part-time mayors and part-time supervisors, and especially now when you have supervisors staying a term or two, that these may get missed. So anything we can do to educate the municipalities on what options they can do to protect their position on these projects is good. So,
All good stuff. Can we just stop back for a minute? Is there anything else on this information for the application information? Are we good with what we got with that one addition?
Just Paul's correct or addition.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, good.
Okay, decommissioning?
And just before we get into that discussion, I'm just raised now, so Justin has time to gather his thoughts if needed. I didn't mention, is it worth, Justin, maybe kind of briefing the committee on the communications we've had with real property about trying to set up a meeting, what their plan are for creating suffixes and such, and how that impacts our pilot administration?
This for the land value we're talking about?
Yeah,
I sent out a detailed message to the county attorney, Dave Paulson, and to, the woman with real.
Roxanne Burns.
Roxanne, I
Yeah,
think,
yep.
or
Yeah, Roxanne.
Roxanne, yeah, they didn't respond, so I'm hoping to get to the point where we can have that discussion with them and hopefully have an outreach to all of the local assessors, so we have some uniform treatment. We've enhanced the form of letters that we're sending out to the taxing jurisdictions and the assessor when pilots close or when we amend pilots. Recently, we did 2 OIA amendments for Robinson and Wayside that involves sending a new 412A application. What we're doing is within that application, instead of just sending the pilot and saying, here, please make it exempt, that doesn't fill in all the detail associated with these projects. A typical project will be one tax parcel on a building going out that it's a hotel, a manufacturer, or whatever. These more often than not involve a portion of a parcel that we assume a stub parcel number will be assigned to. It's 50 acres out of 100 or whatever it is. What we're seeing, or at least what Dave is seeing, and Lyle and Marshall and on the administrative side, is that within the county, and this is what's done with 487, kind of the proper way, is that they don't exempt any of the land value, but rather they just create a stub parcel and assign a value to the improvements, the array, if you will, or the facility that generates energy. And that's what 487 exempts. 487 does not exempt any land. So under a 487 pilot, the land is still taxable. The farmer or whoever gets a bill pays it. Under the ground leases, if there is an enhancement or a change in value of the land, the farmer gets a bill. And to the extent that they have the ability to charge that differential back to the developer, they do under the ground. IDA pilots are different though. We get a leasehold interest in that portion of the parcel and we lease it back. Our UTEP says we don't abate that value as it's assigned. So right now, if that 50 acres has a $500 an acre assessed value attributable to it because it's agricultural or just fallow, that's obviously going to change because it's now commercial property. It's being leased for a commercial use. So you would think the assessor is going to dramatically change the land value. And that would be a developer obligation under the pilot agreement. We define under the UTEP that the project's going to pay full taxes on the land as assessed plus the $5,500 a megawatt, escalating at 2% either forwards or backwards. What's occurred though in the first batch of projects that we have online, I don't know if there's 10, there's a number of them, is that there's no land value being assigned. And there's a little resistance at the assessment side to attribute a land value there. But mechanically, the IDA project can't exempt anything unless we exempt the land in the first instance. That's the interest that we have. So we're trying to work with the county and real property tax services and the assessors to get some uniformity, for lack of a better term, on how they approach IDA-led renewable projects. So we have that metric. In the absence of a value being assigned to the land for that stub parcel, it's hard to administer the pilots. Lyle's kind of taken the next step. In the absence of that, he's kind of coming up with a value, billing it. But that's really the assessor's department. If whatever commercial land happens to be assessed at, and their community, it'll depend on a case by case. So we kind of set that backdrop to the county attorney and to the head of property services, and we're looking to try to see if they can catch up on the ones that are already online, and for those going forward, having that land value assigned so the pilots can be administered. In some counties, it's kind of like a sticker shock. They get a bill in the first pilot year. They're like, wait a minute here. Depending on the size of the parcel, the land value with the existing bill rates can outstrip the 5,500 or whatever the metric is per megawatt, and maybe even double the bill. And then if there's a significant amount of, a couple dollars per thousand type thing going on with special district charges, whether it be fire, water, sewer, or whatever, it can actually add up. I think most developers are doing their due diligence and will understand that in addition to the pilot, they'll have other expenses on a going forward basis. But some of them I've seen are just under the presumption that the fixed dollar per megawatt is it. But there's more to it. So what we're doing in our communications now is sending out the pilots with the 412A application along with a survey and the legal description of the boundaries. So the assessors and the taxing jurisdictions aren't just getting a pilot agreement with a schedule on it. They're actually getting something that looks like the tax parcel with the actual ground lease area surveyed and described, so they can look at that information, get a report that a pilot is closed, and what exactly it involves. So hopefully sending out more information and more materials associated with the IDA projects will help the other partners in the process have just as much awareness on what the project involves, as opposed to just getting a pilot and kind of trying to fill in the gaps on their side.
Good question. So you're sending out a meets and bound description with all the pilot documentation. Maybe we need to add to our project requirements a GIS shapefile, and I'll go into more why that should be added then, so that it can be shown on the tax maps as with some sort of legend item, the outline of their leasehold interest. And that's going to come into play for the agricultural exemptions, because one of the things we're banging off of with soil and water is they're refusing to take mid-year adjustments to shape files. Let's say that 100 acres has a 50-acre solar farm and they have an ag exemption. Well, we need to know the soil breakdown of what's no longer eligible for an ag exemption. So you need to send something to soil and water and have them do a ag breakdown based upon leasehold interest. And Jay, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they are flat out refusing to do that. Accurate, Jay?
I don't know that answer, Paul. I have not had that conversation with our soil and water conservation district, but I can certainly check on that.
Real Properties Mapper has had that conversation.
The office there
to
is,
make it unless it's in the shape file on their GIS system. They're not going to do it.
okay.
Mid-year.
That is not a surprise to me, Paul, but it is news to me.
So that's something, Dave, we need to work on. If we're going to do this, where you're going to actually have a meets and bound description of the leasehold interest, and if there is an ag exemption on it, soil and water needs to be brought into line where if they get a shape file, they'll give the assessor or the property owner, and this should be up to I don't know whether that's a developer or a property owner requirement, who should be doing it, but
We have the nexus to the developer through our application. As a standard requirement, I don't close anything unless I have an alpha survey, along with the actual ground lease and, the description. We can't really close it up with description anyway, that's a component of the lease. And things like that. But I asked for the alpha, they generally have to, 5 years of having developed by their engineers in order to get through permitting. If there's another layer or electronic file, maybe that helps. I can understand a little bit of the resistance. We see that with assessors, they like to do mid-year or full adjustments because it's disruptive and creates more work. Perhaps the ag districts are on the annual cycle and don't like to alter their maps unless they do them all at once a year. I'm not sure if that's the reluctance or if it's because they don't have the right data points. I'm not sure, but.
It sounds as if it's on the Soil and Water Conservation District side, Paul. And it's just a matter of them having to redo their soil group worksheets. It's not that big a process, especially now because it's all on GIS, as long as they have the shape files. If they don't have the shape files, then it's not possible for them. But it's just a matter of Soil and Water redoing their soil group worksheets and giving those to the assessor. Those aren't that.
I understand the process completely.
Yeah.
I'm just telling you, talking with Chris and the GIS office, that they were working with someone and they flat out refused to do it, so.
The Soil and Water Conservation District did.
So, do you know, does the county planning department have the ability to the overland calculate that, or is it a requirement that Soil and Water do it?
I believe it's in state law that it's a Soil and Water Conservation District function.
I will talk to Chris or Dave, somebody can, and find out the real scoop here, and then maybe we need to have a meeting. Well, Christine Watkins is leaving, right?
She is retired. Pat Crast is the new executive director there as of last week.
Well,
And we're gonna take the step where we're going to put the land values in our IDA. We need to make sure that things are correct, and one of those things would be if there's an ag exemption, withdrawing that from the calculation for the land and the leasehold interest, so.
Paul, if I could just add to that, I think we should be requiring those shape files be sent to Jefferson County Planning Department so that we have that data available to us, because we can only guess, to a degree, what the impact is to farmland without having those shape files. Those shape files will give us a much better understanding of what the impact to farmland is from those projects. So it should be something we would require anyways, and that information I would suggest goes to county planning. I'm gonna just say it bluntly, much easier and much more responsive to work with.
Paul,
I think Justin said he's not going to go forward without, you were talking about shape files too, Justin, weren't you, as along with the meets and bounds description?
An Alta survey, which is,
Okay.
a surveyor standard, showing pretty much, every fence, every little thing that's associated with the project. But
Okay,
the data sets you're talking about, I think are probably electronic files that we can also require to the extent that, there is an impact on ag. And sometimes we don't know that, but, we can ask the question, and to the extent that those things have been modeled by their engineers, that is a dump drive, or something like that.
I don't think it's a big deal, none of these projects are being designed without GIS, so.
Paul, I have a quick question coming back to real property tax. As the land under these panels flips from agricultural assessment to commercial assessments, and that'll happen the first year, right? As that happens, are some of these towns going to end up creating or need to create a special category within the commercial land values? Rather than, normally when it flips to commercial, you've got all those characteristics that derive to the higher value. But under solar panels, a lot of that
New
criteria.
York State has a property class code system, and that's more of a bucket to push in the right direction for valuation. So really, the classification, it's more going to be about the inventory collected by the assessor when they value it. And if, I don't know of any of these projects where they have fee ownership of the underlying land that we're talking about. So if they're leased land, the valuation model projects the total cost of the project, including the land. So how you code that in the state's inventory management system is indifferent. The valuation model is going to pump out what the project's worth land in total.
And that'll fit the solar application very well, you think?
Probably. My concern about showing the land value on I'm concerned this by making where the assessor has to put the land value on themselves. That opens up litigation a little more than where the model predicts it, so. But this is all new. We're gonna find out in March 1st with some of these projects that are existing. I think they're gonna see changes in what their assessments are. Significant changes.
For sure.
So bottom line, do we want to require that JS shapefile as part of the application? Is that what we're saying?
I would encourage it.
I would think before closing, we should get it. If a project comes into us early enough, they may not have complete final design GIS shapefiles at that time.
Maybe we do that, maybe we just add a note.
Follow some of the things that are happening with these ORESs. They've had to, from when they first started, they've had to move project lines around on parcels to meet their setbacks
Right.
along with lot coverage. So if you got the shape files until their final design is approved, they're really meaningless.
So maybe what we'll do is we'll put a note in the application just saying a GIS shapefile will be required prior to closing.
I doubt that'll be an issue with anybody.
No, I agree, yeah, but just so they know we're gonna need it, and it would be appreciated as soon as possible, so. Sound good?
Well, sounds good.
Okay.
We, back to decommissioning.
All right. So I think everybody has received the draft recommendations to municipalities that the ad hoc committee has developed. There are 7 of those. If not, let me know and I can go get copies made of them. But I sent them out enough. I thought everybody's probably seen them more than they wanted to. Next week, the ad hoc committee will be meeting again to finalize these recommendations. And we had some good information come in from Katie Malinowski over at Tug Hill Commission about their work with municipalities and putting into their laws requirements for decommissioning plans. And so I think we'll also be talking about those next week and the possibility of making those recommendations to municipalities as well. And Paul, I certainly welcome, what you were talking about on the making sure municipalities are not missing these notices from solar developers. If you can make sure we cover that next week as well, you're signed up for the meeting, if I remember correctly. I'd welcome your guidance to the ad hoc committee on that as well. The nice part about it is this effort has already blossomed beyond Jefferson County. Jefferson County Farm Bureau took these recommendations, put them into draft policies that they recommended to New York Farm Bureau. And New York Farm Bureau this past month adopted those as their statewide policy guidance. So every county farm bureau now will see these recommendations. The other nice part is the state agencies such as Ag and Markets will definitely see these come across their desk. So hopefully, we can impact New York State Ag and Markets with their guidelines that they're giving to municipalities on decommissioning plans. Hopefully, this will have a statewide impact through this effort. That's really all I have to report. Like I said, next week, the committee's coming back together and starting to lay out the steps of, okay, how do we take this further? And also now incorporate this guidance on potential laws that municipalities will want to put in place in regards to solar project decommissioning.
There's one project, one of the ORES projects, the large ones, and I don't know whether it was AES, it's the ones in Clayton. And maybe it's Tracy. Is there one that's in Clayton and Orleans?
Yeah,
That's Tracy, right, Ed?
I think so. Right.
Well, if you go on there, you can see where they make a request of provisions that they ask the siting board to waive because the state has ability to override local zoning. And in one case there, they've asked for the state to override the decommissioning requirements of the local zoning law. And it has to do with the amount of bond, because if you look at some of these decommissionings, they want you to believe that the decommissioning is a zero-sum game, that the value in the recyclables is more than the cost to send it to recycling. I find that hard to believe, but that's what some of the documentation they submitted is. So that should be interesting to watch to see how municipalities react to the projects asking for their decommissioning laws to be overridden by the state or overruled by the state.
And along that line, Paul, it's how can you project 30 years from now what the value of recyclables will be?
Well, most of the ones I've seen have a 3 to 5 year review of the projections of decommissioning costs. Okay, but going back what Justin has warned us about, in 3 to 5 years, Project X may not be owned by the company that signs the agreement. So that's even more why we have to pay attention as they assign these or transfer whole ownership of, let's say, what's the project there? Tracy Solar is, I forget that, let's say that was AES. They may sell that to another company, may sell Tracy Solar to another company. So we have to follow that and make sure they understand all their requirements. But
The bond is held in favor of the project, no matter who owns it. It's an asset of the project, the bonds are paid for, it's a, a depreciable asset. So I don't see a concern about portability necessarily, as long as it's put in place in the first instance intelligently, in a way that has scale and has a little bit of consideration for future, inflation and changing out the economics. But they're not going to fall away if the project sells. The bond's held in favor of typically the town, the host community, and the premium paid is an asset appreciable by the entity. So if it's X, Y, Z LLC that happens to go from beneficial ownership by one development concern to another, it's still going to be parked there and an asset. So it's enforceable. I think, as you pointed out, it's the important thing is to make sure that it's designed intelligently on the front end. And the work that Jay's doing right now, I think, is really getting more awareness out into the municipal community that there's things to pay attention to and make sure that they're building on the front end.
it's good to know. Let's face it, that's one of the biggest impacts that's going to face future board members, whether it's a town, village, or even the county, because at the end of the day, if the decommissioning bond is really inadequate, they're going to walk, and it's probably going to fall back on the county to help as the So,
It depends, I think, I mean, no one has a crystal ball, I certainly don't have anything like it, but, right now, the absorption of development is a function of interconnect. And there's also regulatory throttling on, the size and scale of projects. So what you're seeing is, you're getting anchors thrown in ground that are, in terms of capacity and generation, are being restricted in a number of ways, in a number of factors. What I think will occur is interconnect expands, and that's through distribution development in the future, large-scale distribution projects. That anything that has an anchor in the ground is gonna go from 5 to 10, 15 to 20, and it's gonna be like Legos. So I think if you're gonna predict that there's gonna be less instances of projects being abandoned than instances where they're just gonna be added to a larger scale, panels will evolve, panel capacity will evolve. I think to the extent that there's space, they're gonna continue to grow as opposed to falling. But,
one last thing on decommissioning, when I was talking to Doug Shellman, who is a supervisor for the town of Ellisburg, we all know Doug. And he had a meeting with Borlex, Jay, on their as his role as supervisor over their decommissioning plan. That'll be interesting to hear the details of that next week.
Yeah, thanks for the heads up.
So under the new regulations for large commercial siting approval from the state, are they handling decommission? Does that take decommissioning criteria out of town and county's hands as well, potentially?
Maybe. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Justin, but the state will determine whether or not their decommissioning plan is adequate, but they're also required to seek the input from the towns or the host community as to the decommissioning plan. So, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the state that makes the final determination on whether the decommissioning plan is adequate.
I would guess it's gonna fall back on the town 30 years from now, when somebody's gotta go out there and observe or investigate whether the stuff has been removed. See, somebody, I don't know who they're planning on doing that.
Well, it's the decommissioning plans, the guidance calls for the designation of an environmental monitor. And that environmental monitor will start on day one of the project going in to collect data and prepare for that decommissioning 20 to 30 years from now. Then when that project has reached its useful life or is abandoned or whatever, the environmental monitor is to oversee the actual decommissioning and restoration of that land. And we're suggesting for 2 years after it's considered complete to continue monitoring that so that, if there's problems with drainage or fertility or things like that, the company can be called upon to fix those problems.
So
So
this is an employee that's gonna be, this company's they're gonna hire to come and do this work then?
according to Ag and Markets guidance, yes, the solar developer would hire that environmental monitor. Our guidance is that the municipality consider contracting with somebody to do that environmental monitoring. Obviously, having the solar project pay for that. I don't know how well that's going to be received by Ag and Markets because they're the ones that are suggesting that it's working fine, although I don't know where it's been tested with new solar projects.
Right.
But they're the ones that are suggesting this works fine to do it this way. But I always have a concern about putting the fox in charge of the hen house, and that's exactly what this does.
And it's guidance. It's not regulation that says, I want to see a report at the end of the year from the environmental company that's doing the work. It's not a required annual reporting. It's it's guidelines that this is how we should do it. At the end of the day, who's gonna do it, who's gonna pay for it, and is it ever gonna get done?
Right, that's what I always wondered, even, so this would be a yearly thing, they'd go do a survey of the place then, Jay, or?
No, initially, before the project, construction starts, that environmental monitor would collect data on the current state of the property, soil depth, soil compaction, a variety of different criteria they would collect on the property as it is before the first piece of dirt moves. That information would be put into the decommissioning plan. Then when the project reaches its useful life, that environmental monitor would then follow the decommissioning plan and make sure that the company is doing what is in that plan.
So the baseline would go in with the project, the baseline of the soil makeup and the.
Correct. That's what we're trying to encourage. Right now, that isn't necessarily going to be complete. Some of it is recommended in guidance, but it's not adequate. It's nowhere near adequate. What is recommended by Ag and Markets for these decommissioning plans.
So I guess that answers my question. The guy doing it today isn't necessarily gonna be the guy doing it 30 years from now, because he's got the database.
Right.
To reference them.
Right. Somebody will have, because, the chances that it'd be the same person are pretty slim. But somebody down the road would have that data. And we, in our recommendations, we call for the municipality, the landowner, and the solar company to have a copy of those decommissioning plans. The current guidance isn't that specific. So great, you leave it in the hands of a solar project company that, shifts hands a few times. Now where's the plan? So, if I had my druthers looking across the state, I would encourage soil and water, and based on my background with soil and water conservation districts, this is something I would encourage soil and water conservation districts to be very active in. And they have the capability of calling upon the right scientists if necessary. And they do this type of service in other ways across the state, with stormwater regulations and so on. So I'd love to see soil and water districts, but I shouldn't be, placing it so heavily on their plate. I can only encourage everybody to take a look at that, because that to me makes the most sense statewide.
Well, and I think the county has a little bit of pressure to maybe shift soil and water to some new requirements as far as, what they're working on as a county sponsored funding. You have, the county does have a little bit of monetary clout.
Anything else on decommissioning? I guess we're down to unfinished business or other business.
One question, and we obviously we're not prepared to discuss it today, but in terms of host community agreements, I could be wrong. It seems I saw something that was going to be some requirement for the utility scale projects under the state rules to provide some sort of community benefit.
I do remember reading that. Yeah, that was part of that.
I'm wondering, is there anything you want us to do in terms of pursuing that discussion with the board in terms of what we want to do about host community agreements for future renewable energy projects?
I know it's kind of a moving paradigm.
I think the
isn't it?
state requires them to put an X amount per megawatt aside that
Right.
goes to reduce local residential utility rates.
Right.
I don't recall that much, that they have to put money into a pot for that. But if there's a host community agreement, that'll be negotiated by the ORES group. And if I'm missing something, Justin, from your knowledge, that's my recollection of the regulations.
I think you're in the weeds deeper than I am, Brad. I appreciate, I'm looking for you too.
So I think like on the Borlex project, it's like 50 or 60 grand you have to put in a pot for 3 years or something like that. And it has to go out to the utility customers. I'll look and we'll report back on that.
How about, update on the Deferred project?
Oh, yeah, so, we've, I signed, and actually, yesterday, I was at a meeting with, Bob Hageman and David Paulson, so Scott Gray, chair, he signed the, agreement. Dave Paulson was gonna send it to NYSERDA so they could sign the MOU. So that MOU basically is the agreement, we'll start moving ahead, NYSERDA's gonna start at phase 1 immediately. Environmental, we'll follow up, hopefully by January, their plan is to start at phase 2 environmental, start moving forward in the plan. What we'll have to figure out now too is that the town of Wilna and the village of Ferry had submitted a joint application to the state for $180,000 for a brownfield opportunity area plan, which is a planning grant for dealing with environmentals. So now they've got that and we're on board with this MOU. We'll need to get together to figure out how can we deploy that funding and kind of advance the project and move it along. But right now we're in the process of getting the environmentals done, kind of so we know what's involved there. So eventually we get to the point where the IDA or some subsidiary that we create of the IDA, an LDC or something, would take ownership of the property, lease it to NYSERDA, they develop the permits and the approvals, the plan for a solar project. You do an RFP, developer bids, is selected to do the project. The idea is, big picture, that we would provide, a pilot incentive for the project to come along, but shape the incentive such that there's a requirement sitting in there for the developer either to take on the remediation or to contribute to a fund to remediate the parts of the property that are not yet developable because of debris, brownfield issues, and such like that. So,
Do we know if there's any PCBs in the mastic there?
Will that have to be? This is at this point in time, we signed the memorandum and we proceed forth to do the evaluation.
we're doing the evaluation and kind of like identifying what the strategy might be. So there's no commitments at this point, other than us to cost share with the county, the environmental,
Right.
with NYSERDA for the phase 2 environmental.
But looking down the road as trying to determine if that is a developable site under this criteria, it may come back that it's just cost prohibitive.
Well, they're feeling right now that about half of that site, the 200 and some acres, is developable.
But to get any benefit through NYSERDA or any, benefit monetarily or permitting otherwise, do they not want to make sure their primary focus is to clean up a toxic site, is it not? So could they end up leaving the site and letting us develop some solar opportunity on the other half of the site? Or is it gonna have to be cleaned up before?
No, so we will what we're talking about conceptually, and of course details will come as we investigate more, but the idea is that you get a developer in there that would actually develop solar on what's developable now. And then while that project is being developed, we'll be moving ahead on remediation for the remainder of it. When the remainder of the property is remediated, it would then make it developable either for additional renewable energy and or some other commercial purpose. So the development can proceed before the remediation occurs on the other part. So they would develop what they can in the short term and then proceed with remediating and additional development as the rest of the property is remediated.
So will all that be determined? I'm just foreseeing, we can start developing the site for solar, but 2 years from now, as the final cost and the final process to remediate the contaminant there on the other half of the site comes to the table with a dollar amount assigned to it. There may not be money in the coffers to move that project forward and it sets on hold.
Well, I think what we're hoping is by the time NYSERDA develops a plan for developing the renewable energy on that site to help meet the state's renewable energy goals, we'll also have a strategy in place for the remediation, what needs to be done to remediate the rest of it. So a developer would come in, and part of the overall deal would be we're providing you these incentives to develop the solar on this project, but in part of return for and still make it attractive enough that they can either afford to either take on remediation of the balance of it or contribute to a locally controlled fund to remediate the balance of it. But it would all be done kind of together, not, so as the developer comes in to develop the solar project, we'd have an idea of what needs to be done by then. As opposed to coming up at some later date with a plan, there'd be a plan at that point for remediating at the same time they come in to develop. So it's all kind of planned out ahead of time.
Shows more promise then, under that criteria.
Yes.
This is probably maybe a question for Justin, but so there is a process where the county can foreclose on that and still not take on that liability, and how does that liability go from one entity to another? Is there a liability, or how is NYSERDA trying to take care of that? The county is, of course, in years past, is reluctant to foreclose on that because then they assume the liability of the cleanup.
I think you would, whoever the owner is.
Yeah, I'll let Justin, because the approach right now is we're working on an MOU, NYSERDA's working on an MOU with DEC, which Justin has provided some comments on, that would basically provide protection to the county and the IDA or subsidiary. And then they're also working with EPA on providing some kind of what they call the letter, but some terminology. Basically, we're looking to have those protections in place from EPA and DEC prior to taking anything on.
Okay. Anybody else got any unfinished business or new business, other business?
How much money did they spend on the DeFerriet site to remediate that? Or not the one in Calcium there, the old mill?
Oh, no, I'm not sure what you mean.
It wasn't McLaughlin. Yeah, it was Calcium. The old, the site that's been cleaned up the last, it was finished a year or so ago. It was the old,
You mean about the J&L site up in St. Lawrence County?
no, don't worry about it now. I'll get the time.
If there's nothing else, I guess we should adjourn.
Make a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
All in favor?
Aye.
Hey,
All right. Hey, Dave,
Yeah.
are we planning an executive session for you